It's one of the most popular stories in all of American literature. She kept writing, but she was not in a hurry to get married. We might call this depression or burnout today. We would now view the treatment that Mitchell advocated as psychological torture. Many women developed a mistrust for mainstream medicine, so many women really did find relief through these methods. She became the highest paid female author of her lifetime. Although her professional life was going well, her marriage was not. But it was generally understood that they were only married on paper. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel where we explore the fascinating history of American religion. Today, I have something special in store for you. I want to talk to you today about the story that most captivated me in my childhood, and I may not be alone here. It's one of the most popular stories in all of American literature. It's been made into a lot of movies. It's available in basically every library. You will have read this book probably if you were a girl who grew up in America. When I first discovered it, it was the Hallmark Hall of Fame movie version of The Secret Garden. And I watched it over and over again. I memorized it. I swear to you, my parents had recorded it on the VCR, so it was available to me. I watched it so many times. As a result, my mother thought she should give me a copy of The Secret Garden for Christmas. This is the copy that I was given as a child, but I was not satisfied with that. So, I'm telling you, I was obsessed. As a teenager, I bought a smaller copy to carry around in my bag. And so I had this copy to just take with me and read. I read this book, I'm telling you, so many times. So when I was in graduate school, I had started to realize that my favorite childhood story was, unbeknownst to me as a child, a treatise on American religion, a very specific kind of American religion. And it was offering the author's viewpoints about how religion should be used to help people. As a result, when I ran across this annotated copy of The Secret Garden, it's by Gretchen Holbrook Gerzina, I had to buy it. And of course, this book, the Gerzina annotated version of The Secret Garden, is really helpful for the information that I'm going to share with you today. There are, of course, other scholars as well who've examined the religious views promoted by The Secret Garden, and I've drawn on some of them as well. I will definitely be putting a list of possible sources for you in the description to this video. So if you want to learn more about what we're covering today, you can do that. But if you're familiar with the story of The Secret Garden, you're probably thinking this isn't a story about American religion at all. Even if you think, okay, maybe it's about religion, how is it about American religion? It's set in Yorkshire. It's about a little girl who was growing up in India, and then her parents died. Her parents were English, but living in India. And then her uncle took her in Yorkshire, and he was misanthropic and a hunchback, and she discovers she has a secret cousin, and they work together to restore the garden with the high wall that they were not supposed to go in. I mean, none of this sounds like it would be a story about American religion, but it is. So this video will establish, in part, that this is a story about American religion itself by focusing on its author, Frances Hodgson Burnett. What's interesting is that this has become such a popular story completely out of the context of its own time, and therefore completely out of the context of the messages that it was trying to send. This story was written by an American woman with themes of American religion that would have been understood as such by the people who first encountered it. But we no longer have the context for it, so it doesn't seem like that to us. 19th century America and early 20th century America were a time of intense religious experimentation. I've already told you about Mormons in Utah who were trying to establish a religious utopia and rewrite the English language by developing a new alphabet. But there's a whole lot that went on in the 19th century. This channel is probably going to talk a whole lot about the 19th century because it's so influential for our own time, but in ways that we don't recognize today. A lot of 19th century people in America were not satisfied with traditional religious responses to their spiritual questions, and they set forth to find a new way to satisfy their longings. And so it's during this time that we see a lot of things happen, and Frances Hodgson Burnett is a really good example of an American who was trying to navigate this new religious world. Ultimately, I would love to do a really deep dive into The Secret Garden because it shows us so many different facets of the American religious world that was developing in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But I don't know if anybody else is as fascinated by that as I am, so we'll just have to see how this goes over. This may be a one-off. Who knows? During her lifetime, Frances Hodgson Burnett's writing was extraordinarily popular. She was one of the most famous people in her time. She was at least as famous as any of our literary giants today, so the Stephen King, perhaps, of her time. And you may be saying, wait, Stephen King, she's a children's author, but she really wasn't primarily a children's author. And The Secret Garden, as we'll get into later, really wasn't necessarily a children's book. She was best known in her time for books that we don't read today. So I'll go over a brief list of the ones that she was most famous for. That Lasso Lowry's was about an impoverished Lancashire teenager who wanted to make a better life for herself. Through One Administration is about political intrigue in Washington, D.C. and 19th century women's role in American politics. Little Lord Fauntleroy, one of the few children's books that Burnett wrote, is about a New York street urchin who inherits a surprise fortune and becomes an English aristocrat, and teaches the English aristocracy how to have empathy and compassion. The Shuttle is a tale of two sisters, one who sets out to save the other from a bad marriage, which, for the sake of YouTube's terms and conditions, we'll just say was criminally problematic, and I'll mention more about that soon. The Dawn of a Tomorrow, finally, was about a wealthy Londoner who was deeply depressed and contemplating ending his time on Earth and encounters some poor but happy people who teach him the secret to having a happy life and change his mind. He decides to live and has a happy life in the end. So, as you can see from this list, Burnett was primarily writing for adults, and it can be argued that The Secret Garden was for adults at least as much as it was for children. The Secret Garden was initially published as a serial in an adult magazine, and then it was later published as a book in 1911. It contains the clearest exposition of her religious philosophy, although we also see hints of her developing religious ideas in The Little Princess, which I'll say something about later, and The Dawn of a Tomorrow and The Shuttle. But Burnett wrote more than 50 novels, 13 plays, and countless articles and short stories that appeared in diverse magazines in England and America. Americans in her time thought that she was American, and British people thought that she was British, and they were both right. Burnett was born in Manchester, England on November 24th, 1849. Her father was a business owner. He had a metalworks shop where people could buy things like doorknobs and candlesticks. But when Burnett was 3, her father died and her mother needed to take over the business and take care of the family. The family at the time consisted of Fanny Hodgson, as she was known then, and her 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Things were going okay until the American Civil War broke out. And this meant that people in England couldn't get cotton for the textile mills, and this meant that the people could not afford to buy things like new tableware and doorknobs, and things were really not going well. The family was really struggling. Meanwhile, Fanny, as she was known, was a voracious reader, and she was reading all kinds of literature. There was a neighbor who thought that she was getting into the wrong kinds of stuff, like gothic novels and romances and cautionary tales that told women not to marry for money. And so that neighbor got her into some more appropriate, or, Victorian appropriate literature. But Fanny retained her love for trashy novels, so we can see that to some extent in some of the things she wrote later on. Burnett also loved playing in gardens, and being in gardens was something that was important to her throughout her life. So after Mrs. Hodgson decided that she could not keep the family afloat by running the family business, she took up an offer from her brother to move to Tennessee. The family moved to Tennessee to be with Burnett's uncle in 1865. He had led them to believe that he was doing well and prosperous in Tennessee, but that actually wasn't true. So when they moved to Knoxville, things did not go well, and they relied on their neighbors for food in order to keep from starving. At this time, the young Fanny Hodgson decided to try to make money on her own, and she tried a few different things, ultimately settling on sending a story to a magazine. All she got back was an invitation to send more, so that didn't work out very well. Fanny Hodgson published her first story in Godey's Lady's Book in 1868, Hearts and Diamonds. After this, she never faced rejection and published basically everything that she wrote. She was always able to make money this way. She was an immigrant writing for her new country, but writing with this marination she had in the themes of Victorian English literature, both the respectable kind and the trashy kind, and this came through in her writing. Eventually, the Hodgsons got their own home in Tennessee. After they moved there, Fanny met her future husband, Swan Burnett. She accepted his proposal of marriage a few years later and began going as Frances. She kept writing, but she was not in a hurry to get married. After some pressure, she finally said that she would marry Swan after she had taken a trip to England in 1872. But again, she took her time. That trip took a year and a half. She really was not keen on the idea of getting married, so it seems. But that was an expectation of women at the time, and it's unclear to me why exactly she decided to marry Swan, but she married him in 1873. Everywhere she went, she kept writing. A year after their marriage, their son Lionel was born in Knoxville, and 6 months later, they headed for Paris. When the family moved to Paris, they took along a formerly enslaved woman, Prissy, who acted as a nanny for Lionel so that Burnett could keep writing. Her husband was in ophthalmology school, and therefore Burnett was the sole breadwinner for the family. And she was continuing to sew all the family's clothes and those things as well. She was really very busy as a working mother. She was writing day and night to support the family. Soon she was pregnant again, and in 1876 she gave birth to a second son, Vivian. That was the same year that her first novel, That Lass o' Lowrie's, came out. And she faced a new problem. There were unauthorized compilations of her works being published. That Lass o' Lowrie's had previously been a series of serial stories in a magazine. Similar things were happening where she would write serial stories and then somebody else would publish them. And she really didn't get to challenge that because she hadn't retained copyright. She got a new publisher to publish 2 compilations of her stories, though, and her popularity was really growing, so she was able to earn more. When Burnett returned to the U.S. with her husband and 2 sons, they set up their house in Washington, D.C., and they kept up a really active social life. Although Swan was now a practicing ophthalmologist, Burnett continued working as well, and they had a 2-income household. She would write while her sons slept or competed for her attention in the mornings, and she continued to put out a lot of content. She published 2 books and a play in 1881, and she also reworked some of her longer short stories into full-length books. But she had been writing nonstop for years and experienced something we might call burnout today. After that, she just didn't write anything for 3 years. In June of 1880, Burnett wrote something that describes what she was experiencing. My backbone disappeared, and my brain, and when I found they were really gone, I missed them. Their defection seemed so curious that I began to try to account for it, and finally rambled weakly round to the conclusion that it might be because I have written 10 books in 6 years and done 2 or 3 other little things, I generally lie on my back and despise myself. We might call this depression or burnout today, but the term that would have been used in her time was neurasthenia. So 19th century language neurasthenia, also called Americanitis because so many Americans were diagnosed with this, was kind of a catch-all for this nondescript kind of illness. Most commonly, this was associated with professional people in sedentary occupations. Neurasthenia is still diagnosed in Asia, but in America, you'll be more likely to find people diagnosed with depression, anxiety, migraines, various gastrointestinal issues, and not neurasthenia, which suggests the depletion of the nerves. We'll get more into that later on. Burnett sought treatment for this intermittent condition in various ways throughout her life. During this first major bout with neurasthenia, the family took trips to the mountains in North Carolina and the beaches in New England to help Burnett rest and recover. This was a common way to respond. People need rest, you take them out into the countryside, and sometimes they feel better. However, it's important to note that in Burnett's lifetime, a new treatment for neurasthenia was developed that was particularly brutal. This became the most common way in the late 19th century and very early 20th century that doctors approached women with neurasthenia. So the treatment was called the rest cure primarily. It was popularized by a Philadelphia neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell. The rest cure consisted of social isolation, bed rest, massage, and force feeding for a period of 6 to 8 weeks. The conditions that Mitchell used this to treat, we might call today depression, anxiety, migraines, gastrointestinal issues, possibly various other autoimmune conditions, just all kinds of things they didn't have a real explanation for, and primarily for women. Mitchell believed that all these illnesses were the result of a depletion of the nervous system, and the treatment was designed to rebuild it. The rest cure was relatively short-lived. It gave way to psychoanalysis in the mid-20th century, but a lot of women were enduring this in Burnett's time. We would now view the treatment that Mitchell advocated as psychological torture, and Mitchell acknowledged that the women who he treated had a severe aversion in many cases to his treatment. The rest cure was an improvement over other popular treatments that it replaced, like hysterectomies or long-term institutionalization, but that's basically all that it had going for it. Patients were generally not allowed to read, sew, or feed themselves. They were not allowed to sit up in bed or even turn over without the doctor's permission. They were not allowed to see their friends or family at all. They were isolated completely with just the nurse and the doctor. They would be force-fed, usually meat and milk, and also given supplements that included iron and cod liver oil, but also things that we now know are poisonous, like strychnine and arsenic. If a patient refused this high-fat diet of milk and meat or the supplements, they would be force-fed through the nose or the rectum, or sometimes just beaten until they submitted. This treatment was overwhelmingly given to women, and there are many women who've written about how destructive that was for them. Many women developed a mistrust for mainstream medicine because the treatments that were given to them were harmful, and they began seeking out alternative therapies. As early as the 1880s, Burnett began exploring alternative therapies to help with her own problems. The options available to her included spiritualism, theosophy, and Christian Science. In 1885, she sought treatment from Anna B. Newman, a student of Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. Burnett also bought Eddy's book, Science and Health with a Key to the Scriptures, and began attending Christian Science services. Her son Vivian and Vivian's wife would later become Christian Scientists, but Burnett was never fully able to commit to the religion. Burnett was never able to fully get on board with the idea that illness never comes from germs or that evil and suffering aren't real. But she was drawn to many themes in Christian Science, which was the case for many women in her position. For many chronically ill people at this time, the medical and religious explanations given to them and the proposed responses that they were meant to employ simply weren't satisfactory. So Christian Science offered a new way toward relief, and that was the power of positive thought. Positive thinking changed reality, but so did negative thinking in this framework. And because people could unconsciously pick up on one another's thoughts, then what you think might influence someone else's life. New Thought, which branched off from Christian Science, held similar ideas, but also explored Buddhism, Hinduism, and Theosophy in addition to Christianity and the Christian scriptures. The term New Thought was adopted after Eddy sued some practitioners who were using the term Christian Science, but she felt were not in alignment with Christian Science ideas. It was meant to stop these unauthorized teachers and healers from using the term. I'm just doing an overview of this right now, but Mary Baker Eddy and her followers would definitely be enough material for their own video if this is something that interests you. Just let me know. So the real distinction between New Thought and Christian Science, if you want to think of it this way, is that New Thought was compatible with many different belief systems, whereas Christian Science was a religion unto itself. You may know the kind of themes presented in New Thought as they've been repackaged recently in 2006 under The Secret.
This is the great secret of life.
And popularized by Oprah Winfrey.
And reading Newton's law, third law of motion, which says for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, was like a religious experience for me.
And you've probably been exposed to it in many other sources as well. Do you know a story about a train engine, a little engine, that's able to pull a really heavy load up a mountain because it repeats to itself, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. Well, The Little Engine That Could, first published in 1930, was a New Thought book for children. I think I can means I can in New Thought. That's true for the little engine anyway. So over time, this power of positive thinking became secularized, but at the time that Burnett was encountering it, it was deeply religious. Nobody would have questioned that. Women made up 72% of Christian Scientists by 1906, and many of them were earning a living as teachers and healers within that system. What a Christian Science healer would do then and a Christian Science nurse would do today would typically be to sit and meditate with the patient. They would focus on positive statements and deny the reality of illness. Christian Science healing could be practiced either in person out loud, silently, or even at a distance through telepathy. So women like Burnett seized on what Christian Science offered in part due to an aversion to medical interventions like the rest cure. Possibly due to the placebo effect, New Thought and Christian Science methods do tend to work. They help people to feel better. That's not to say that they necessarily cure the underlying conditions, but they can help people to come out of depressive episodes, for example. So many women really did find relief through these methods. Burnett does not seem to have been breaking free from the Bible at the time that she was exploring Christian Science, and Christian Science is rooted in the Bible, so that's not surprising, but it doesn't seem like New Thought was really drawing her in as much. Burnett did not share Eddy's views about some things. Like I said before, she was not able to believe that matter wasn't real, that evil and suffering aren't real, that illness is never caused by germs. The path of healing and transformation for Burnett comes from confronting evil and one's enemies. So we have New Thought, right? But Burnett referred to her own philosophies as the beautiful thought. Scholar L. Ashley Squires has written, Burnett shares with Eddy a felt sense of the world as a struggle between good and its absence. At this point, Burnett had exclusively written for adults, but she got an idea for a children's story and wrote Little Lord Fauntleroy in 1886. This book caused her fame to skyrocket. She became the highest paid female author of her lifetime. Although her professional life was going well, her marriage was not. Burnett began spending a lot of time in places that were not Washington. In 1887, she took her sons to England for a summer and then to Florence for a year where they attended school. At this time, she wrote another story, Sarah Crewe, which she would later rework into The Little Princess, another children's book. She then got word that an unauthorized play was being written in London based on Little Lord Fauntleroy and immediately rushed there. Burnett's planned lawsuit in response to this not only secured her own dramatic rights, but the dramatic rights of all authors in England. She now had immense wealth and bought a 17-room house in Washington using her own money and paid cash. She and her husband still didn't have a good relationship, though, and the big house wasn't big enough for them to live in together. So she kept taking really long trips without him. Divorce would have been a scandal that very likely could have ended her career at that point, so it really wasn't an option. But it was generally understood that they were only married on paper. During one of her trips, she got a letter from her son Lionel, who complained that he wasn't doing well. He said he was depressed and he missed her. She also got a letter from her husband saying that Lionel seemed to have the flu. She didn't rush back right away. She wrote back saying cheerful things and hoping that he would feel better. And one of the reasons that she didn't rush back right away seems to have been because she had developed a friendship with a man named Stephen Townesend. This man was a young English doctor who was an aspiring actor, and as Burnett produced many of her own plays, she could help him with his dreams. It's unclear what their relationship was really like at that point, but she did not return home and soon ended up in an accident. Her horse-drawn cart overturned and threw her into the road. She hit her head and was unconscious, suffering from a concussion. Townsend was the one who found her and helped nurse her back to health. She was in a coma for days and had a very slow recovery. In the spring of 1890, Swan wrote back again to say that Lionel had tuberculosis. So Burnett finally returned to Washington to try to help her son. She spent months taking Lionel to spas in England and America, hoping he would get better. Usually Swan and Vivian came along, but when Vivian needed to go back to school, Swan took him back to Washington, and Burnett took Lionel to Paris with a nurse, and she would write in the early mornings to help pay for his care. Ultimately, in December of 1890, Lionel died of his illness. As Frances was grieving the loss of her son, she began to focus on children more. She split her time between England and America. In London, she established a clubhouse for working-class boys. At this time, her writing really shifted to child themes. Vivian enrolled at Harvard in 1894 and spent summers with her in England. She was in London for almost 2 years. Swan got his own house in Washington when Burnett returned there in 1896. When she left in 1898 for England, taking her sister along, she left Swan with divorce papers. Swan remarried, and Burnett leased a house in Kent, England, Maytham Hall, where she spent a lot of time in a walled garden writing with a tamed robin as a companion. She lived there for several months each year for a decade. In 1900, Burnett agreed to marry her former doctor, Stephen Townsend. This was a scandal. The press accused her of robbing the cradle. But the marriage wasn't good anyway. She says that she married him because he blackmailed her. He was jealous and angry and made her fear for her life. It wasn't long after their marriage that Townsend returned to England and only visited Burnett to get money from her in Kent every so often. At Maytham Hall, where Burnett was writing in a walled garden with a tamed robin as a companion, she planted roses that climbed all over the walls and everything else. It was there that she wrote books with very dark themes about marriage. The darkest is probably The Shuttle, published in 1907. The book is about strong women who overcome their overbearing and harmful husbands in transatlantic marriages where the women are wealthy but the men are not. For the sake of YouTube, and for those of you who came here wanting to learn more about a children's book, I'm not going to go into any great detail here. Suffice it to say, the themes in The Shuttle are much darker than you might expect from the author of The Secret Garden, one of the most beloved books in all of children's literature. I should emphasize again that she primarily wrote books with adult themes for adults, so that part isn't really surprising in her own time. In 1908, the owner of Maytham Hall decided to sell it, and Burnett was unable to buy it, so she returned to America, where she bought a house on Long Island not far from her son Vivian. As a matter of fact, that house was next door. She had a house built next door to her son Vivian. At this time, she was complaining of insomnia and sought treatment at Fishkill Landing Sanitarium in New York. It seems that she was subjected to the rest cure to some extent there, where Dr. Fowler would allow her to only write 1 letter per day. He suggested that she avoid reading or getting out of bed. Burnett did not respond well to this treatment, and it caused her to lose her faith in medicine itself. After this, Burnett decided she would try to heal herself through gardening. She returned to her home on Long Island And there, she wrote The Secret Garden, which was published in 1911. She continued to write after that dark books about the tragedies of World War I and its aftermath in the Jazz Age, and continued to be a popular author. But nothing that Burnett ever wrote would have the staying power of The Secret Garden, a book that really didn't have much staying power at all in her lifetime. Gardening was very important to Burnett and her views about medicine and spirituality. Her last article, which was published after her death in 1924, includes these lines: "As long as you have a garden, you have a future, and as long as you have a future, you are alive." Seems like Burnett was criticizing the rest cure and the things that medicine was offering to women at the time. In The Secret Garden, she offers a new idea, which isn't that neurasthenia isn't caused by a depletion of the nerves, but that the treatment for it is all wrong. She proposes a spiritual, female-centered treatment. The book we know today was first published as a serial in the American Magazine, which is an adult magazine, and early reviews said that it was equally appealing to adults and children. Spoiler alerts, if you haven't read the book or watched a movie or whatever it is, and you plan to, and it will harm your enjoyment, then you can skip this part. The story opens in India, where a 10-year-old girl named Mary Lennox finds that her parents have died in a cholera epidemic. She doesn't have much emotional response to this because her parents were distant and she'd mostly been taken care of by servants. Ultimately, after she is orphaned, Mary is sent to live with her uncle, Archibald Craven, who married her father's sister. Her aunt is also deceased, having died in a tragic accident. Mr. Craven lives on the moors of Yorkshire in a large house, Misselthwaite Manor. Mary's care, as it had been in India, is overseen by household staff. Mrs. Medlock, the housekeeper, and Mary's maid, Martha Sowerby, are the characters Mary has most of her early encounters with. She also runs across a curmudgeonly gardener, Ben Weatherstaff, who has a tamed robin as a friend. Mary is said to be ill, in a nondescript way. She is very thin and listless, with a sour disposition and a yellowish appearance. She initially hates everything and everyone, but as Martha tells her about her late aunt, Mary becomes curious about the high-walled garden where Mrs. Craven used to spend her time among the roses. Mr. Craven was so traumatized by her death that he locked the garden and buried the key. No one will tell Mary where she can find either the door to the garden or the key, but her curiosity drives away her negative thoughts, and she starts to get better. She wanders around the gardens on the estate, and the robin leads her to the area where a dog has been digging in the ground, and there she finds the key to the garden. Later she finds the door and unlocks it. The garden gives Mary a secret project, so she asks Martha for some gardening tools. Martha sends her brother, a 12-year-old boy named Dickon, to bring Mary the tools. Dickon is a somewhat magical figure with the ability to tame wild animals through his kind demeanor. Mary confides in Dickon, and he helps her work in the garden. One night, Mary hears someone crying and follows the sound to discover she has a cousin, also 10 years old, Colin, hidden away in another part of the house. Colin is ill in a non-specific way, suffering from fevers and unable to walk. He spends most of his time confined to bed in a manner reminiscent of the rest cure, with his care overseen by doctors who insist he must not exert himself. Because Colin has a nasty temperament, the servants obey his every whim, but Mary feels no need to do this. She visits him daily, and this distraction, with her stories about the way gardens grow, help drive away his negative thoughts. Eventually, Mary tells Colin that she has found the key and opened the secret garden. Sworn to secrecy, eventually, Colin and Mary get permission to go together to this garden, although they keep their destination a secret. They instead go out with Colin in a wheelchair and Dickon to push him, as if they are just walking around the grounds of the manor. In their regular trips to the garden, both Mary and Colin find healing through the fresh air and the positive focus they have on helping plants grow. They start to eat more and gain physical strength. They hide all this by eating the foods that Martha and Dickon's mother sends them secretly, things like eggs and potatoes roasted in an outdoor oven. They pick at the rich foods offered them at home in favor of eating these more humble offerings. I will say, as an aside, that Silas Mitchell's book detailing his treatment method was called Fat and Blood and How to Make Them, and Burnett here seems to directly contradict him. Mary and Colin make fat and blood shown by the weight they gain and the color they get in their faces by positive thinking, fresh air, simple food, and time in a garden, not by resting all the time and being force-fed. Although Colin's legs are weak from not being used, he begins to learn to walk with the encouragement of Mary and Dickon, who, in contrast to his doctors and other authority figures, show optimism about his future and continually push him to believe he can do it. Colin learns to walk, while his father is spending time away abroad. Slowly, as his son's thought patterns are changing, this has a corresponding impact on Archibald Craven, who ends up dreaming about his late wife calling him back to their garden. He decides to return home and go there. And there he is surprised to find it in full bloom, with his son in good health, having just won a race against his cousin Mary. They explain to him how both the garden and they have come back to life from a dormant state through the power of their optimism and the healing qualities of the garden. And even if they hadn't explained it to Archibald Craven, Burnett does take the opportunity to explain it to us in chapter 27. So I will read a short section of that here. In each century since the beginning of the world, wonderful things have been discovered. In the last century, more amazing things were found out than in any century before. In this new century, hundreds of things still more astounding will be brought to light. At first, people refused to believe that a strange new thing can be done. Then they began to hope it can be done. Then they see it can be done. Then it is done. And all the world wonders why it was not done centuries ago. One of the new things people began to find out in the last century was that thoughts, just mere thoughts, are as powerful as electric batteries, as good for one as sunlight is, or as bad for one as poison. To let a sad thought or a bad one get into your mind is as dangerous as letting a scarlet fever germ get into your body. If you let it stay there after it has got in, you may never get over it as long as you live. So long as Mistress Mary's mind was full of disagreeable thoughts about her dislikes and sour opinions of people, and a determination to not be pleased by or interested in anything, she was a yellow-faced, sickly, bored, and wretched child. Circumstances, however, were very kind to her, though she was not at all aware of it. They began to push her about for her own good, when her mind gradually filled itself with robins and moorland cottages crowded with children, with queer-crabbed old gardeners, and common little Yorkshire housemaids, with springtime, and with secret gardens coming alive day by day, and also with the moor boy and his creatures. There was no room left for the disagreeable thoughts which affected her liver and her digestion and made her yellow and tired. So long as Colin shut himself up in his room and thought only of his fears and weakness, and his detestation of people who looked at him and reflected hourly on humps and early death, he was a hysterical, half-crazy little hypochondriac who knew nothing of the sunshine in the spring, and who also did not know that he could get well and stand upon his feet if he tried to do it. When new beautiful thoughts began to push out the old hideous ones, life began to come back to him. His blood ran healthily through his veins, and strength poured into him like a flood. His scientific experiment was quite practical and simple, and there was nothing weird about it at all. Much more surprising things can happen to anyone who, when a disagreeable or discouraged thought comes into his mind, just has the sense to remember in time and push it out, by putting in an agreeable, determinedly courageous one. Two things cannot be in one place. Where you tend a rose, my lad, a thistle cannot grow. We may view it as a children's story today, but it's a story about children that was intended for consumption by all ages. In her own time, the book was quickly forgotten, and you don't find it listed in the obituaries that came out after her death in 1924. The book was, as she said herself, an exposition of her philosophies. She believed that fear and unhappiness were dangerous, and she also believed in the power of preserving oneself from fear and unhappiness. Why it was about children might be because she told the New York Times that people should believe in some great power that is taking care of us like children. In 1910, she had told the Kansas City Post, "I go about with a dark lantern, evading unpleasant things. I practice a doctrine of elimination on that which will not make me happy. I am the prophet of happiness." In the early Victorian days, it was fashionable to be unhappy and morose, but we have changed all that now. Further, she said, "Unhappiness is indecent, not respectable, and futile. I believe our big creative powers of things intellectual are the powers that come from without. That is the real manifestation of the psychic. I have noticed that when I write a book. It is not a blurred, reddish-haired woman who has been sick a great deal and suffered much who writes my stories, but the power from without. Like many people in the early 20th century, Burnett was starting to see science as a belief system, akin to religion, alongside religion, maybe even a religion unto itself. The Secret Garden combines themes of Christianity, New Thought, nature worship, paganism, and science. And she explained this mixture herself to the New York Times in 1913. I am not a Christian Scientist. I am not an advocate of New Thought. I am not a disciple of the yogi teaching. I am not a Buddhist. I am not a Mohammedan. I am not a follower of Confucius. Yet I am all these things. By Mohammedan, she meant that she wasn't a Muslim. She wasn't involved in Islam. By the time a new version of the book was published in 1949, a version that had been illustrated by Nora Unwin, the new generation of children who read it did not have the context to read the religious views that were in it and understand them for what they were. They didn't pick up on the fact that this was a religious treatise that was heavily critical of the medical establishment and religious views offered by the mainstream in the time that it was written. When it went out of copyright in 1986, it gained new interest, and film adaptations and books and all of these things began to come out, and it's probably one of the reasons why women of my generation, potentially younger women as well, have really been captivated by this story. But the films tend to conceal the religious message of the book. They tend to refer to a generic concept of magic, not as a way that you're able to tap into divine forces or spiritual forces, but just as something that exists in a magical fictional world distinct from our own, or in the imagination of the children who are engaging with it. It's really not presented in modern adaptations as if it is a religious philosophy, which is why most of us who were reading it as children or watching these films as children did not see that for what it was. So it's ironic, really, that in her own lifetime, Frances Hodgson Burnett was known for writing adult novels with extremely dark themes and not books for children, and now is primarily known, if not exclusively, and potentially exclusively, known as the author of one of the most beloved children's classics in all of American literature, and is not remembered as an American. I no longer carry this book with me. I haven't in a long time, and yet I don't want to get rid of it because it was really significant to me. And as I said, I would like to do a deeper dive into what she was saying if that interests the rest of you. But for now, we're done with the overview of the life of Frances Hodgson Burnett and her religious ideas and how she put them into her writing. I really thank you for sticking around to make it all the way to the end. If you like this kind of content, I would really appreciate it if you would let me know. Until then, all of my imaginary friends, please stay well and stay curious. Bye-bye! Coming soon on The Relighistorian. 18th century people saw things quite differently than 21st century Americans. There was not a widespread consensus about things like church and state. Religious minorities were worried, especially those who'd been marginalized the most in colonial society. Strong anti-Catholic sentiment influenced American politics well into the 20th century. Seixas coined a phrase in his address that became one of the most influential. As much as Washington had said these things, and as much influence as he had, it just didn't play out that way.